WLS.
Hosted by IDM.
And yeah, we are live. It's the final countdown. I don't know, who cares?
It's gonna get copyrighted. You're doing such a great impression, Marcelo, that YouTube is not gonna like that.
Yeah.
Welcome to
everybody?
another
Hello,
fun-filled
Nina.
episode. I'm doing pretty well. How are you doing, Marcelo?
I look like crap, but it's all right. I think 3 nights with sleeping deprived, and I'll be looking like Zelensky, which
This
means
is very
that
true.
2 weeks
So
of
you're-
parenthood can be equivalent of 2 years of war.
Oh wait, we're allowed to talk about this? Can we talk about that for a second?
Yeah.
Let's
Yeah, of
everyone,
course.
let's congratulate Marcelo on becoming a father. Yay. We are very happy. This is why he was away. Everything is great, but he's sleep deprived. So
Yeah.
welcome to the club. This is not why
Thank you.
Zelensky is sleep deprived,
No.
but now you can maybe understand him a little bit better.
Yeah, I guess we can compare 2 weeks of parenthood to 3 years of,
3 years of war.
sneaking
Soon you're going
stuff
to
and
be
war.
you're going to be showing up wearing military fatigues like Zelensky. You're just going to stop shaving. You might do a little bit of
Next week,
mood
I promise I'll
enhancements.
be in a decent stage.
Yeah. Well, as long as you're not going to be doing any, piano dancing or anything else that he's done in the past, please spare us that. But anyway, congratulations. You guys, if you're in the chat, congratulate Marcelo on
We have
On
some
entering this
congratulations
new-
already.
super important stuff in his life. We're super excited about that everything went well. But yeah, today we have another exciting topic. Usually we talk about death and destruction. Today we'll just talk about death. And what we want to talk about is the death of the West, which sounds like a very exaggerated topic. Obviously, there are books, songs, movies with this title. And to make it more manageable, we want to talk about aesthetics. So we want to talk about visual arts, maybe a little bit of architecture, but primarily painting, drawing, and that domain. And so the reason I wanted to talk about this is something that for people who are not even plugged into culture, who are not plugged into art, may not have any education in this regard, they're on social media. And on social media, you'll see a lot of these self-described conservative accounts, traditionalist accounts. Some of them go viral. They have millions of subscribers. I don't know why I don't yet, but I should. And they would do these posts where, let's say, they would compare a major city. They'll show you, let's say if it's in Europe, they'll show you a beautiful Gothic cathedral, and they'll do a side-by-side with some, pretty ugly modern structure. It might be a corporate building. It might be some kind of a remodeling that went wrong. A lot of times they do this basic popularized education, I guess is how you would call it. Some of it is pretty good, where they talk about the aesthetic styles in the West of the past versus today. And this is something that's being discussed a lot. Again, obviously it can go into other realms. Culture is a very broad term, but we wanted to narrow it down. And for those who may not know, as you know, I'm formally educated in history. I have a PhD. I've then willingly abandoned the academia. So I am an amateur historian who is formally educated. But most of you probably don't know that I also have an education in traditional art, in fine arts, that I originally wanted to be a children's books illustrator. And as I get older, I think I'm going to somehow make my life work and get back into that domain, although I'm quite rusty. And I also have a master's in art history. So I do have some formal training in terms of understanding what I'm looking at beyond maybe some of the ideological readings that we may be getting from the so-called left and the so-called right in this regard. So, and I've also noticed that I think a lot of people kind of start understanding what's going on, or maybe trying to understand what's going on, of course, through their own personal experiences. They might see like an ugly public sculpture in their city. They might then watch a documentary on some, architecture 1,000 years ago somewhere in Northern Europe and compare it to what they're seeing today. In my case, it was also education in art school and being educated by people who were themselves or were educated by abstract expressionists. So they had a very particular trajectory and a dislike of traditional arts. And by that, I mean figurative art, naturalistic art. And so I had a lot to draw from before I really could understand the ideological component in this domain. But before we jump into this, Marcelo, can you screen share some of the popular things that get criticized? One of them is the Christmas tree.
Yeah, since we're talking about people being plugged on this scenario, I guess. Oh boy, yeah. Okay,
let's try to screen share.
I'm screen sharing it. Oh yeah, you don't see it, right?
No, I can't see it, but if it's up, it's up. And
it's
this
up.
This is from a decade ago, so it's already been 10 years. This is something that's been criticized. It was eventually taken down. A lot of people complimented it nonetheless. This is supposed to be a very stylized, let's be diplomatic about this, version of a Christmas tree. People compared it to a toy of unmentionable nature, as you can imagine. And ultimately, this, I don't even know if we can call him a sculptor, an artist, did admit that it was supposed to be a satirical and it was supposed to have this sort of undercurrent that is not quite in line with what a Christmas tree is supposed to represent, even in kind of a sanitized corporate space, which is much, much, much removed from religion. And the other one, it's more recent, and in the past couple of years, it's been making the rounds on social media. It's the breastfeeding man, if we can pull that one up as well. I don't see it, but I'm assuming it's on the screen. It's up. And so you can kind of see why this one would be such a mindfuck, for the lack of a better word, because it's actually executed in a fairly naturalistic style. It's not. It looks like human form, right? It's not stylized to the form to the point where you are unable to recognize what this is. And at the same time, it's representing things with which people would have an issue with for many reasons, ideological reasons. You can kind of imagine how in the modern culture war in the West, this would be problematic for many reasons. So these are just some examples that you probably have seen. And this is what I mean. You might be completely unplugged from visual arts, but you've probably seen posts about this on social media. Marcelo, what do you think yourself by seeing these two things that are about 10 years apart?
Plus this last one, the sculpture of the breastfeed man, it's very classical. It's very Roman Greek style of, and I love sculpture. I truly love sculpture. When I go to museums like the Vatican Museum or Le Louvre, I always enjoy being to the part of the sculptures. I think it's so beautiful what they do there. Here in my city, once upon a time in the castle, there was a sculpture, a bust, that was so perfectly done because it was kind of half marble, half red marble, and it was so perfectly sculpted that the lady, it was a lady bust, a lady face with what's it called, like a veil, a veil on the face. And
was it like a Bernini? Was it a Bernini? Possibly?
No. It was not famous. It was not a famous artist. It was a local artist, ancient local artist. And she, since it was half white, half red, the hair was red. The back of the head was, and it was perfectly sculpted in the way that the face was white, the bust was white, and the back of the head was red. I truly enjoy it, and this looks like a well-worked sculpture.
Well executed. So that's what I mean. That's why it's a mindfuck, because it doesn't get the typical criticism of not having the skill to carry out realistic figurative art. It does have that skill. However, there is some issues with that. So what do you think about it?
Well, yeah. So when we look at sculpture, especially, I think we look at proportion. We look at details like hand veins or what's it called, the ligaments, the one that connects the muscles to the bones. Sure. All those things, and well, then you see something that is not anatomically correct or accurate, or perhaps not in the in a sense that we're used to. I personally don't like this kind of stuff. I think that's my personal opinion. Okay, when I go and I like abstracts, I like art in the most different ways, as long as it's pleasant to the eyes. And I see here comments that one of our friends here saying that my eyes, they burn. And that's
Do you think the artist's primary goal was to make a political statement, or was there some other motivation?
Yeah, I mean, art is the thermometer of society, as I understand. And when I see something like that, I see that, the artist for sure wanted to show his stuff. And I mean, it's his stuff. I don't like it. Perhaps someone likes it. Should it be publicly displayed? I don't know. That's a very delicate point, because some people say, oh, it's all right, the guy has his penis out, or ladies with the boobs out, but when this is this, it's, I don't know, I don't enjoy the idea. It's me. I'm not sure how to answer that.
Sure. And so again, we're only looking at two works that are 10 years apart, but it's kind of giving you an idea of the fact that even if something is executed within the general parameters of naturalistic, realistic art, the ideological, the political meaning seems to trump any aesthetic value that this work has. And that one is kind of exceptional, not in its meaning, but in the fact that it even has any kind of aesthetic value, because most public art, I would make the argument, is at best very sort of lukewarm, including things that cost cities millions of dollars to procure, and there's debate with municipal councils, et cetera, and then it gets placed in this public space, and it just ends up being, I mean, I sent you this other link. Again, it's not recent. It's called Ugly Public Art. You can kind of see a range of things as well. And so the reason that this is being debated, then you can kind of see how it fits within the parameters of the general culture war, where the meaning trumps aesthetics. But in order to understand that, we have to go back. So when we talk about Western art, it's already a bit of a loaded concept, right? So when we use the term the West today, we know what that means, sort of, right? We are basically referring to art that comes from Europe. Things get a little bit murky when we get to Central and Eastern Europe, because those are also politicized terms. Some of them are heavily linked to the Cold War. Things get even murkier when we get to parts of Russia, which is like, what is Russia? We talked about this many times. It's this great in between. It sort of has some European culture. Sometimes it surpasses European culture with its own culture that's influenced by European culture, but it's actually not a European country. You have Asian countries that emulate Western art and music better than, I would make a claim today, East Asians, than contemporary Western European countries. You also obviously have the United States, Australia, sort of former parts of various European empires that are independent states today. So when we say the West today, we basically mean sort of the rules-based order and friends, right? We mean NATO land. But these countries, when they perceive the West, sort of the official narrative is that they trace their lineage back to ancient Greece, right? Which you can kind of see why this was, on the one hand, makes sense, and on the other hand, it doesn't make sense, right? So, for example, if you go back to, thousands of years ago, let's make it kind of a very general period. It wasn't so much a Western culture, it was a culture around the Mediterranean basin, right? For obvious reasons of being, having a good climate, fertile soil, the ability to navigate, et cetera, et cetera. So you know that the countries that were in that general area were not all countries that we consider European today, right? Like ancient Mesopotamia, for example. So already you kind of have an issue with what is the West today. And this has been discussed to death by various pundits. I think ultimately, for the sake of having a discussion at all, you have to make the caveat and just say, you know what? It's problematic, but we're just going to go with a modern definition of the way the West perceives itself, even though it's sort of tracing itself to this pagan period of, let's say, classical Greece in terms of art. But generally, it's a Christian-based culture that came much later, right? So already there is that problem. And then the other problem with this definition is that we have these pundits that we talk about on social media and elsewhere, some of these really viral accounts, they make a very, well, they don't even necessarily themselves say it's a rough parallel. They make the comparison to what's going on today in Western culture in the context of the culture war, but also this perceived aesthetic decline or real aesthetic decline, right? You can kind of choose your poison here. They compare it to the collapse of the decline of the Roman Empire as it was being overrun by Germanic tribes. So if you think about art from that period, obviously the Romans, again, very roughly speaking, relied heavily on classical Greek models, right? Mm-hmm. They introduced certain elements themselves. This is not an art history course, but if you've ever looked at that question, you know what I'm referring to. And even when Rome in its late period was Christianized, the Christian art that it was producing still maintained, to a certain extent, these aesthetic norms, right, of portraying people in a fairly naturalistic way. And then here come these Germanic tribes, right? So we're sort of in 5th, 6th, maybe 7th century, and their art is completely different, right? Sometimes it's not even figurative, it's literal jewelry, right? Because they're moving from place to place. It's very small things. Sometimes it's heavily stylized animals like birds. Sometimes it is human forms, but it looks like a child had drawn them. So this art is the reason why several centuries ago, we even have the term the Dark Ages that then was sort of converted to the Middle Ages. So it was, even back then, when it was initially introduced, I guess, what was it, in the 1800s, maybe even earlier, it was supposed to be a very biased ideological term, right? It was comparing one culture to another. So again, when I look at this question, there's sort of like, I think we should allow for certain cultural relativism because this is different people that came there, that the counterpoint is that they did not have that same mentality as the late Romans did. They did not have the tools, the training, the tradition of creating this type of art. So that cultural decline is not like a gradation. It's just like a different people coming in there. But at the same time, I feel like you can't be completely relativist and say you can't compare the two on aesthetics, because obviously you can. And so if you're using that to measure them, that you could say, yes, when you look at late Roman art versus this, Germanic art of Clovis, let's take him, it does look like it's a collapse, right? It does look like all that was beautiful, according to European norms, has been lost. I don't know if you've ever looked into this question. You said you go to museums, but I'm not sure how
I'm, as I say, I'm a complete ignorant on art. I never studied art by itself, but I'm the kind of person that I like what I see. I consider good art what I like, and I see, what I see and I like and I enjoy. That I mean, we had the conversation with Sasha Krainer the other day, and one thing that really touched me when he said that, yeah, we should start, funding or crowdfunding or state funding beauty. And that was a very touchy message that he sent. Yes, we see nowadays, we see architecture. We haven't mentioned architecture yet. Architecture nowadays is very functional. Not even nowadays. I mean, we can go back, from the middle last century, and we have these blocks of concrete and everything. For example, I have myself in Rio de Janeiro. I never enjoyed buildings made with bricks, brick facade buildings. Here in Italy, everything is bricky, and reddish and pastel colors and stuff like that. It's beautiful because it all works together. And you just mentioned earlier that, yeah, you have some very classical buildings, and in the middle of that, you have some, Trump Tower or whatever, that is completely, it can be beauty. It can be beautiful, but in the context, it's not, it's not aligned with everything else. And it kind of makes it weird. In Rio de Janeiro, in Copacabana, we have an example when Copacabana was built up, all the buildings in front of the beach. There was one building that was kept alive. It was, like, it looks like a small castle. It's beautiful, but the local architecture, it looks so disconnected from everything else there. That is beautiful, but it's weird to be there at that place. They should, just move it all together to somewhere else. Of course, I'm just saying nonsense on that, but it became not beautiful anymore. It's not as beautiful as it should be. So yeah, I don't have the knowledge of history of art and everything, but when I see here in Europe, for example, yeah, Europe has a lot of beauty, and I see what you also mean by the decay of the beauty. They are just, putting the beauty aside, the art aside, and building whatever is needed. Rome is a good example of that. Rome is a very ancient city. It's hard to bring more civilization there, new civilization there. When you try to build a subway, you suddenly step into some 3,000-year-old other Rome that is underground, and then you have to stop the construction, and then you have, because it's the law in Italy, you have to call the archaeologists and everything, and then they have to dig that down, and it takes time, and progress does not go forward. They should just, in my opinion, close Rome as a city, as a functional city, make it a open air museum, and move somewhere else to progress, to build industries, to build whatever is necessary, because it doesn't work anymore as a city, as a functional city. It doesn't work anymore.
Well, I don't disagree with you, but I would just say the devil's advocate argument here, and in fact, it's a very common argument that's usually attributed to leftists, take it for what it is that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And perhaps it's easier to look at architecture and say, yes, this concrete building is unattractive, whereas this old church cathedral is beautiful. But it becomes more challenging, again, from the standpoint of the devil's advocate, when you talk about human form. So then the question is it culturally specific, or are there some universal forms of beauty? I think this is sort of where that collapse started to happen. One of the reasons why this collapse started to happen, I would say, is we were heading from, like late 20th century, from modernism into postmodernism. This is when the theorists of postmodernism talked about the collapse of grand narratives. This is when we started having sort of relativism regarding history, whose history, the fact that winners used to write history, but now we're going to challenge it. And so it's not necessarily wrong, but of course the challenge here is that relativism, some people would say, has gone too far. And so when you talk about the idea of beauty, the way you were describing it, it was very, very personal to you. You said, well, I consider it's beautiful, therefore. And so then it might be a bit of a challenge, in terms of what other people consider beautiful. And so again, from the standpoint of playing the devil's advocate, when some of these really viral accounts, let's say, talk about the beauty of the human body, right, in Western art. And again, when we use the term Western, we're sort of using it with all the caveats that I presented. And the counter argument to that is that the aesthetics have actually changed, right, in the 2,500 years of Western art. If we use classical Greece as the starting point, as the traditional modern definition of the West, NATO land, right, uses it. And so if we look at classical Greece, the bodies are very athletic. They're definitely beautiful. They're very athletic. They have visible muscles. If we then head into, many thousands of years ahead, we had to medieval Europe. Maybe let's go to the year 1200, 1300, and go to we can be in France, we can be in Germany, and we start looking at illuminated manuscripts, and we see the way the women are being portrayed. They're very thin, they're very pale. These are high-class women, right? Aristocrats, nobility, even, princesses, maybe royalty. They have very, very high foreheads, very, very dainty features. They look very, very different from that original aesthetic. They look unhealthy because, presumably they're trapped in their castles instead of having access to open air, of having more of a, farmer lifestyle. Then we head into the Renaissance, which obviously was drawing heavily both on Greek and Roman art, and bodies become more healthy yet again. But at the same time, we have someone like, Rubens in the 17th century, who gives us the term Rubenesque bodies, right? Where women are much more plump. You can see cellulite on them. And at the same time, that was at one point considered aesthetically pleasing, which in our culture today would be considered slightly overweight, maybe a little bit overweight, because we obviously have body positivity, where people who are very obese are still considered to be, within the realm of the acceptable spectrum. And then we can go, we can go into the 19th century. We can look at maybe someone like Ingres with his odalisques that are also quite plump. And so then there's all this variation in terms of what was considered beautiful. And so then the question is this just a matter of style? But is there still a spectrum of us being aesthetically pleasing, even though there are deviations from the style where, okay, these medieval Gothic women trapped in their castles were way too thin and pale with their giant foreheads, and then Rubenesque women were a little bit, they're sort of like drinking a little too much wine at at their parties and hanging out half naked. There's that question, because what we're seeing today is sort of going way, way, way outside of any of those norms, right? We have, like I said, what today's presented as being body positive. We have the literal lack of health presented as that, right? Where that's definitely not within the spectrum of a healthy body, where some people are a little bit thinner, some people are more athletic, other people are a little bit more voluptuous, right? We have a lot of extreme body modifications. We obviously have the gender fluidity. So we're sort of heading into the other parts of culture that I'm trying to leave out, but they keep seeping in with our breastfeeding man and so on and so forth. So you can kind of see, in terms of beauty, it's a little bit more of a complicated question, and I'm definitely not a relativist on this question, but I also don't want to narrow it down to this complete black and white description of this is aesthetic and beautiful and this is ugly, because there is that variation even within the parameters of what is considered Western art. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes. When it comes to my mind, is that it doesn't look like there is enough money being pumped into people to do beauty or whatever, not beauty because we just realized that, beauty is it's a personal concept, but there is a lot of money being pumped in. Of course, here we put two very interesting examples, which is the body fluid and the whatever that thing is
the unmentionable Christmas tree, which is it's definitely offensive to Christians who value their religion. I mean, that's
because we have to remember one thing, that is those things are not free. Those things, it was not someone that decided, oh, you know what, I'm going to pick up my hell lot of money that I have on my bank and I'm going to create that and I'm going to put somewhere. No, those things were paid by the state or by some specific entity that is willing to push these things up. And I think the question here, and let's put these things aside for a second. Street art, for example, is something that I enjoy, I like, but I don't like everything, and I don't like being done like that. Just go there and do it. I have one example of street art that usually myself, I don't mind that it just happens. That is Banksy. It's very discreet. It's very, it kind of does some composition to the environment. And at the same time, we have street art. There's a Brazilian artist that I think it's amazing. He's usually paid by specific, cities or state to paint something for the state. He don't just go there and paint whatever he feels like, which is Cobra. It's his name. I don't know if you know him. A lot of art here in Italy. It's really beautiful.
So it sounds like he's taking ugly concrete buildings and making them more beautiful. So by definition, the people who are funding him realize that these concrete buildings are ugly.
Exactly. It happens in Rio de Janeiro. He painted a fantastic paint on the central part of Rio. Here he has, for example, in Ravenna, if I'm not mistaken, he has Dante Alighieri painting on a wall that was destroyed, so it was just kind of destroyed, and he revitalized that wall. It was just an abandoned place with a broken wall, and he revitalized that with a beautiful painting of Dante Alighieri. He painted Ayrton Senna, who was a Brazilian F1 driver. So everywhere, he has everywhere. And it's usually contracted by the state. At the same time, we have the street art that I'm used to see in Rio de Janeiro, which can be beautiful, but sometimes too colorful, too, and one observation that I wanted to do when you say about the personal way of seeing beauty is that, for example, in Italy, there are laws that when you build something or you're going to restructure some buildings, there is a color scheme that you have to use because the zone is color schemed like that. So even if you do something a little bit modern or something different, then it's going to have the colors of the zone. That keeps things, it's not about just being personally beauty, it's harmonic.
Yeah, we have laws like that here too. It can't be certain colors and it can't be past a certain height, even if it's your private property. There is a council for the city that will decide on whether you can even do this little modification to land that you own. because, like you're saying, it's about the overall look and feel of a town. I don't think every place has that, but I definitely think that's a good thing. But just to clarify, I don't think beauty is just in the eye of the beholder. I would say preferences are definitely in the eye of the beholder, but there's also something that is based on balance, right? There's been so many, I hate to say this, there's been studies done, like I now sound like one of those actually mean dudes, but it's true.
We had sources from the Pentagon that told us that. We have sources,
right? Yeah, but I mean, if you look at thousands and thousands of paintings that would generally be considered aesthetically pleasing, you would find certain balance to those paintings, whether it's like the golden ratio, you know, kind of all these basic things you learn in art history. And that surpasses culture. You can take an African woman from a certain tribe and realize, wow, her face is actually quite balanced, even though her features do not look European, and she is healthy, you know, she is maybe not excessively overweight or whatever. Like there's some balance to the way she looks, and you can take a woman from Greece who resembles, you know that famous picture of a beautiful Greek woman looking at a sculpture, a classical Greek sculpture, and her profile looks very similar. I don't remember, it was like Aphrodite or whatever. So you can take those two. Again, they look very different, but there is a balance to their faces, their bodies are healthy, et cetera, et cetera. So there's like a spectrum, but they all follow certain universal scientific rules. And so in that sense, I don't think it's in the eye of the beholder. There is something underlying there. But yes, people have personal preferences, you know, some, if you're talking about like someone likes blondes, someone else like brunettes, someone likes women who are tall and thin, you know, that's obviously sexual attraction, but it's sort of related to this concept. And so I think that's also really important to know, because it's, like I said, I'm not a fan of this complete relativistic thinking. And that's the thinking that was introduced in, I would say, late 20th century. We kind of saw it gradually with abstract expressionism in the US. I think usually people go to someone like Picasso because, you know, he's the most famous modern painter. But Picasso was someone who had skills of a traditional painter, and he just decided not to use them. And obviously, he was very much about challenging the status quo. And I would say that is pretty different than someone like Jackson Pollock, who would admittedly say, oh, I'm just going to splash a bunch of paint on a canvas and that's going to be art. And I'm not quite there with my technical skills. So when you're creating something, yes, you might be motivated, you might be passionate about it, but that doesn't mean there has to be a level of technical skill, in my opinion. You first have to learn something to negate it. And it seems like at some point in the 20th century, with the middle of the 20th century, the 1960s, really, you sort of stopped having to have any skills. And like I said, when I was in art school, I was educated by people who were either coming out of that period and were retiring, or were educated people who came after them. And this is how they were teaching us. So it was actually an exception to have a professor that was teaching you traditional drawing. And yes, you're now going to go draw realistic nudes in basic art school. This is what everyone is supposed to do, versus I'm going to give you an assignment, and the night before you're going to splatter some paint on a canvas and you're going to get the same grade as Nina, who spent 100 hours on her realistic drawing, you know? So I've had lots of experiences like that. And back then I was young, I was dumb. I didn't really understand. I kind of could see something is a little bit off here, but it, you know, took a while to kind of put the puzzle together. So just for reference, if you could pull up those two, again, I could have chosen, like I said, I could have chosen Jackson Pollock, but I had Jasper Johns, who is another famous sort of painter from that period. This is what kids study in art history. I also had Frank Stella, who passed away last year. So I just wanted to show sort of the type of painting that would be considered modern abstract expressionist, sort of all around that period, and also public art, public sculpture. You can kind of see what they look like. And again, this is stuff that some of it gets commissioned by municipal governments who pay millions of dollars for the population of the city to see it as, in their mind, a way to ameliorate the city, which some people would probably challenge that. I think one of the, I think it was that I sent you the most hated public art.
Yes.
And I think one of them, some of it just looks like badly executed graffiti, right? That you talked about. But I think I had one of the Frank Stellas. Let me see if he is on here. Yeah. So there's that. This is why I sent you. This is why I sent you. Yeah, it's in South Korea. So you can kind of see, again, this is someone commissioned this, right, in South Korea. So it's outside, it's within the rules-based order, but it's outside of, the proverbial West. And as you could see, I don't know if you can actually see the text on the screen, but it said that some felt it looked as though an airplane had crashed, while others thought that the 30 feet tall work was just plain ugly. And so you can kind of see, again, this is an example of someone making these decisions across the board. Like, they're not prioritizing. It's not like people who do more traditionally aesthetic art don't exist. They exist. They're just not getting the funding in many cases. In some cases, they might be. I know there are cases, let's say in Russia, again, sort of outside the West, where these artists are getting funding, but they're not getting funding here. So someone is making these deliberate decisions to make our cities look unattractive, to say the least. But I think it's really good to see this type of thing, because it does sort of show you where, from the middle of the 20th century up until now, so that's a pretty long period, but not really long in the context of, going back to classical Greece, the aesthetic element of art loses its value. It becomes less and less and less important. And the thing that becomes more important is meaning. And it's not that meaning is irrelevant. Right, exactly. I mean, if we look at, I don't know, allegorical paintings from the Renaissance, there could be like 5 different interpretations by modern art historians. Obviously, it shows whoever commissioned it, the rich patron, right? Some duke in Italy, right? Obviously wanted a certain meaning, but first and foremost, he wanted beautiful aesthetics, right? That fit within the style of that period. But what we have today is that meaning completely trumps any aesthetic values. You can literally put, kind of like pop art or any of those, like the toilet from the the second decade of the 20th century, like all of that stuff. You can take an existent object and say, this is art, therefore it's art. So there's lots of examples like that. It's no longer shocking because we've all seen it all. I mean, obviously, when it first came about, it was shocking to the viewer, but it's not just meaning. It's that meaning is very, very trivial. A lot of it is basically satire or sarcasm, which is fine in moderation. But when everything is satire and everything is sarcasm, and I say this as someone who enjoys satire and sarcasm, and I like to be sarcastic, but when everything is that and nothing is serious and there's no deep meaning, like that Christmas tree, right? Oh yeah, it's actually not a Christmas tree. It's supposed to be a sex toy, right? It's almost like the meaning is not even permeating and educating people as public art should with some kind of deep values or some kind of something that would actually make them think. It's just like a meme on the internet, except it's in a public space. It's in 3 dimensions. You know what I'm saying?
Exactly.
So that's go ahead.
Go ahead. I think you just put a point there that is extremely important. It's just a meme in the internet. And I'm going to explain how I see this as extremely important, because for years and years and years, I never understood how art became so crappy and expensive. And nowadays, after, the son of certain president of certain country started painting crap and selling it for $200,000. I imagine you understand who I'm talking about. And putting that together with FTC, what's it? The name FTC's the internet thing, the digital art.
The commission. Yeah.
That made all sense to me. It's just corruption. You can do whatever. You can do you can just throw paint in a screen and sell it for $200,000, and then you're gonna pick $180,000 and bring it back to someone very rich that's going to bring money, funnel money to some institution or some very rich people that's going to get richer. And the excuse that I was listening for years and years that, well, this is conceptual art, and you just made this point. This is conceptual. You have to understand the meaning. But it has no meaning. You cannot understand that. It's crap. And then they say, oh, you don't understand because you're stupid. But we rich people,
exactly.
We understand perfectly what that is. And now we understand perfectly what that is. That's money laundering.
Yeah. Yeah, that famous photograph, again, it's supposed to be making fun of this, of a girl in a museum, and she's looking at a fire hydrant and she doesn't know that it's art. And God knows if it's staged, but it's always making the rounds, even though it's been around for several years, you just don't understand it because you're not smart enough or you don't have the education. When in reality, yes, you're right. The art market is definitely inflated. And again, someone is making decisions. It's kind of like everyone collectively deciding that paper is money and we're all going to use this as money. Someone is collectively deciding, the experts, that this is now the splatter of paint on canvas is actually worth, $6 million, $20 million, or whatever it is. And all of a sudden, this is the aesthetic value that we all need to subscribe to. So yeah, it's definitely there, that decision making. And I think when you kind of see it from that perspective, does that not give you a little bit of hope that it's not like this realistic figurative art or skill is completely gone, that it still exists? There are still people capable of producing works that have a certain skill level. I mean, leaving out imagination or any other kind of values, at least in that parameter, right? It's just not something that's being funded by patrons and in the official West, let's put it this way. So doesn't that kind of give you hope that it's possible to have a resurgence?
I hope so. I do think there is a lot of skilled people around there. They're just not making enough money. And that's
yes, they have to go work in a restaurant, right? As they're producing something else.
I'm gonna give an example, a personal example. My mother, when she retired from working, she had a lot of free time, and she, as a workaholic, she had to do something. So she went to do arts. She started painting and started sculpting. I like her sculptures. She even earned a prize once in Rio de Janeiro in a display of arts. I like her arts, and she will never get the value, perhaps a little bit more than the value of the bronze that she used to work to make the art. So, but she has some beautiful stuff. Some things that I don't like, some things that I like, and in her course, she met with a lot of people with talent as well. And they use, but the point is that I think people need to get retired to start doing this because it consumes a lot of time and some money. And the problem is that people are also not getting retired nowadays. They have to work until 65. So people talking about 70 in Argentina, for example. I think it's crazy, but people are talking about retiring at 70. How will if we go to the Vinci Museum, he was working when he was doing art when he was very young, in the most productive times of his life. In his 20-somethings is the most productive times of our lives, especially on creativity. How can we do that?
Well, the physical
today?
strength needed to, he obviously had assistance, but the physical strength needed to create some of the, not just necessarily paintings, but the sculptures, right? This is something that actually was necessary. So yes, absolutely. This is the height of your productivity. And this is when you receive the training, so you're sort of fresh from your apprenticeship with the famous artist who is now retiring, right, and maybe not working as much. So that's that's definitely not the case of, like you're saying, people need to wait till they retire. But I mean, I can give you an example of my uncle who, you know, he passed away sadly, but he was a monumentalist sculptor in the late Soviet Union, and his sculptures still stand from what used to be Ukraine. I'm hoping this one particular one, I'm thinking, hasn't been destroyed because there's been some fighting there, to Kazakhstan, right, in Central Asia. And they're giant. I remember going to his, and he worked in early Russia too, but early modern Russia, the post-Soviet collapse as well. But back then there was no money. So he was essentially just doing things just to keep busy, but he was not getting funding. But when he was in, a sculptor in the Soviet Union, he made a very good living. So I think that sort of goes to the issue of either private patrons that have particular training and education and understanding of aesthetics, not just in, following the inflated art market, funding it, or the state funding it. And so I think it's also kind of interesting because this is sort of my pet peeve with these self-described conservative commentators, because they will show you some beautiful European building and then they pick some really ugly apartment building from the former Soviet sphere, which is like as if there are no ugly apartment buildings somewhere in North America, and completely ignore any of the beautiful constructions that were erected in the Soviet Union, whether the Seven Sisters, like the Moscow University, these very modern, high modern, but very Gothic inspired structures. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs building is another one in Moscow. There's one in Poland. They hate us, but they kept a building. Any of this, they would trash socialist realist art because it has the word socialist in it, but it's actually very realistic in terms of the portrayal. I'm not saying that the life that they were portraying is realistic. It's idealized, but it's idealized much like Greek classical sculptures would have been idealized, or Renaissance painting would have been idealized. So that tradition actually stayed alive in Russia. And so the painters coming out today, and I periodically share painters that I sort of randomly find out of Russia. Maybe I should retweet this one who painted a bunch of the militia from the breakaway republics in what used to be Eastern Ukraine, right? Donbass. Literally, those paintings were from 2015. Let me pull up his name. I don't think you'd find him on the English-speaking internet, but his name is Alexei Krukov. So that's just one example of many of someone going through traditional art school and getting the education and sort of maintaining that tradition of aesthetically realistic, naturalistic art, right? And so this kind of brings me back to Russia and East Asia, maintaining these cultural forms that the West, as we described it, right, with all the caveats, would consider it being theirs, yet it's actually being maintained in Russia and in Japan, Korea, and China more so. This also applies to what we call classical music. More, and I'm totally not a music specialist, but it's something that I do pay some attention to. And so this is why I left out music from this conversation, but you also see that in that realm as well. So I think it's kind of fascinating that those forms survive outside of the West, right? With big air quotes here. So let me see it.
Let me put on the screen here for a second. I found I found it. So you just Google it. I found the Ravenna display from Cobra. So people that doesn't know it, how it is.
When I think of Ravenna, I think of the the famous church with the mosaics that is sort of like beautiful. Early East Roman Empire. This is the image that I have in my mind. So it's kind of interesting to hear something from a totally different period. Supposedly, I mean, I'm going to look at this video after we're done to see what it looks like. But Cobra is very realistic and modernistic. It's interesting. I don't know how to because I have no idea. I understand. I mean, again, I don't want people to take away here to be that you can only create art that is realistic. My personal favorite painters, a lot of the art is very highly stylized. But the takeaway should be that you should have the initial training of producing realistic art to be able to then not work in that style or that genre, whatever you want to call it, and then produce something else, having had the training. Like before negating it, you have to do it first. And so before going and doing your own thing. So by no means, my own illustration, sometimes, I mean, I used to only do people. It's kind of funny because I live in nature. So I'm in the nerd who is painting crows and like random birds and just animals now. But my other thing, like I said, I wanted to do children's illustration. That's definitely highly stylized. So by no means do I want it to be like, no, you can only draw like Michelangelo and Leonardo and that's it. You're not allowed to do anything else.
This is a point that when you say that even to be counterculture, you have to know culture. Even to be counter painting, you need to have abilities to be a good painter. When you don't have realism or anything, when you just have some colors and shapes, even for that you need to have knowledge, because
you need to understand color
alone.
Theory and composition. Of course, you need to understand that. And I would say, again, there's been sort of a decline in education and educational standards when it comes to artists, where more became allowable in that regard and less was required. I would say specifically in North America, I think in places like Italy, I think there's still, and Russia, there's still a lot of very traditional art education that would be more in line with what art education would have been centuries ago. Again, of course, there are caveats and modifications to that type of education. But I think the bigger issue here is not just the money and the decision makers, it's that cultural idea, now that we've destroyed the grand narratives in the 80s and the 90s, and everything is essentially based on relativism. How do we maintain some cultural specificity, understanding that there are other aesthetics elsewhere, but we could still sort of pull away from this complete abyss of late modern and postmodern art? So there should be something about meaning that is missing, and that is the question that pertains to everything else too, right? To all the basically the collapse of religion with nothing really replacing it, the collapse of ideology with nothing really replacing it. Yes, liberalism sort of dominates the globe, but nothing has really come into, it's sort of being challenged from the multipolar perspective of traditional societies, but there's really nothing in the West itself that is challenging this particular dominant ideology. There is nothing challenging this. Everything, nothing is serious. Everything is funny. Everything is sarcastic. It's basically nihilism, right? That big void is not being filled with anything meaningful. And that is a bigger problem than, we need more patrons to fund people who are talented, because that is sort of the fundamental problem that's underneath all of that. And I'm not sure how it's possible to fill that void.
With that statement, with what comes to my mind was that, I remember when we talk about rock and roll, for example, or heavy metal, all that stuff, when we say that the rock is dead, because usually you needed to have angry and be uncomfortable with the system to fight the system, and the rock movement was more or less about fighting the system, was going against the system, and as I mentioned earlier, the art is the thermometer of the society, and what I see is the art is broken, and Western society is broken as a society. And as you said, all this comes from that. This is very nihilistic, individualistic, very non-social at all. It doesn't portray the society. It portrays a very specific group that is almost antisocial. And one can even
Almost.
say it's fully antisocial.
Yeah, no, there is another word I'd like to use, but I don't think there's some people that don't like that word, so I'll refrain from using it. But yes, definitely anti-social, not pro-social.
Exactly, and at the same time, there's not this angry. There is it's, as you said, to fill this void, but it just seems that society is empty.
I think the question of heavy metal is interesting because it's definitely pop culture, right? It's not high art, but it's something that's also been co-opted, not fully, but I just remember again how heavy metal used to be about rebellion, but in the last few years we've seen a lot of, possibly under industry pressure, promoting the solution to the illness that was going around a couple years ago, basically doing like government advertising for it, coming out with certain flags during certain types of the year that the governments would do, for instance, in June. And so basically that rebellion for a lot of these people was gone. And I know, again, it's pop culture, it's a subculture within pop culture, but that co-optation by late stage capitalism, or whatever you want to call it, is been maybe not complete, but definitely very obvious for a lot of these supposedly rebellious people. And it's sort of like a little piece of the puzzle, but it's not completely irrelevant. I think it's not a completely irrelevant example to what we're discussing. But do we have any questions that we haven't addressed? I haven't been looking at the stream.
We have a lot of comments. I'm not sure about questions.
I think we broke a lot of people's eyes with the initial, and those were not even like the worst images we could have used. It was sort of like, I think we could show this.
Yeah, we have so many comments here, and well, there was one that was very interesting just in the beginning from Orlando, who said that what was it? There is no decay on Western. It was always decayed. I agree to disagree.
This is very Heideggerian. Like Heidegger would go back to ancient Greece to find the source of the rot. So it's actually very philosophical. It's probably beyond the scope of the stream. If we start citing Heidegger, I think we're gonna we might bore a few people, but I think some people might know what I'm talking about when he talked about the source of this problem in, being found more than 2,000 years ago prior to our own time. So okay.
I was corrected here. The thing is NFTs. The
NFT. Oh, you mean
art.
NFTs? Okay, I thought you meant like the FTC commission, not the NFTs. Yeah, NFTs are very scammy.
They just made easier to launder money. Now you don't even have to make art. You just
you can just like
Google Bard to say, hey Google Bard, draw me some monkey and sell it by $2 million.
Yeah, sell the monkey, but the owner doesn't actually get to physically own. Yeah, I think that. Disconnect from physical objects. Again, it's a much broader issue, that disconnect from the fruits of one's labor. Everyone is on the computer, whereas people used to work with their hands, whether in factories or in the fields. That is also one of the issues that is related to the construction of art and the decline of the perceived decline of aesthetics, right? But again, that's sort of a broader philosophical question, which I guess is a good comment about we're sort of trying to isolate this to visual arts, a little bit of architecture, but we keep bringing in these other things that are definitely related and show broader void, broader chasm, I guess, in what is described as Western culture today than just aesthetics. So it's kind of like we try to limit it, but it's not that easy to limit it. Okay.
One example that we kind of passed through very quickly, it was music. One thing a long time ago I thought about with the internet, we had this, what was the before Facebook, the page that you had friends with it. MySpace. You had MySpace, and I had a lot of friends that had bands, and they were publishing on MySpace. Nowadays, with Instagram, I'm seeing a lot of good music being created there. So if this is a point, well, of course, we can also make the argument of good pictures. You know, a photographer can have a good work, perhaps making some money out of Instagram and stuff like that. Although we all know what's Instagram
I'm
about,
one of those purists who learned traditional black and white photography and printed in the darkroom. So when I see kids these days, me, the grandma, just using their digital camera or a phone, which of course I no longer use it. I still actually want to go back to because it's such a pure process. Not having had to balance the CMYK or the CMY colors in a darkroom with color photography, spending an hour on a single photograph. I'm a little bit, there is sort of a democratic element to people having more access to technology. But when technology does more work for you than you, again, it's a little bit of a problem for me. I mean, obviously, AI is an obvious example where you're like, hey, draw me this thing. And some people are saying, oh, look, you're no longer noticing the weird AI hands. That means AI is getting better. So that is obviously a very much related topic. I think if we get sucked into that question, we're going to be here for another 2 hours ranting.
A good example for me is, I forgot her name, a Portuguese singer that is bringing fado, Portuguese fado back. And now we have this mixed artist stuff, you know, so she's featuring some DJ and creating, you know, techno fado, and it's beautiful. It's amazing. It's really interesting stuff. And a lot of Brazilian artists just, you know, playing with, I don't know, you know, those balls that do tac and stuff like that. But they do beautiful music. This is a good example that I have.
Yeah, well, again, I think it's an example where in the ideal, people have more access to technology and maybe their cheap online courses on how to draw a face, as an example, for like $5. So if you have the skill, you no longer have to go to college and spend God knows how much money going to art school when you could go on some of these digital education platforms and take a cheap course in whatever interests you and actually can learn that skill. So that would be the kind of like, everyone is a podcaster these days, like you and I are live streaming, everyone who has an opinion. Hopefully some of those people have some background in what they're talking about. But again, the good side of it would be that democratization of access and technology being cheaper, giving you the ability to produce. The bad side, I mean, we discussed a lot of the bad sides.
There is one question here from Miro. Question, can you inform more how Russian heritage modernized Western art like Stanislavski did with method acting?
So what I know who Stanislavski is. What was the previous Russian who modernized?
Herish, R-E-R-I-C-H.
Oh, like Rerik.
Rerik. I'm sorry, I don't speak Russian.
Well, no, but his last name is actually German, so it's like I could see how. Okay. Yeah, but he's kind of an outlier. He's a painter who, you know, traveled to the Himalayas to paint all the spiritual stuff. So I guess you can kind of make that argument, but I think it's sort of a standalone outlier. I definitely like a lot of his art. You know, I don't know if you know the one with the big skull. That's one of my favorite paintings. Well, Google him. But it's definitely very spiritual, I guess, is the term that I would use. Definitely using more stylized brand of painting. But I would say, yes, I mean, you can look at early 20th century painters that were going back and forth with, you know, let's say Russians like Goncharova being influenced by the French painters, and they're sort of influencing each other because that entire first 2 decades of the 20th century with all those really quick changes in styles with Cubism and Futurism and all those other ones, they were definitely working with each other. And, you know, someone like Goncharova was influenced by Russian icons. So she had this Byzantine influence, but she was painting things that were very modernist. But again, she had the training to execute that type of work. So
I'm going to put on the screen quickly here so people can. It's very Asian-like. If I'm on the right person, please, Miro, tell me if this is the right person.
Is his name Nikolai Rerik?
Rerik, yes.
Yes, he has. Well, I mean, he has different periods as well. So I think it's kind of like, maybe not as bad as like Picasso's blue period versus Picasso's cubism, but some of his works look different. So
it's interesting. It looks very Asian.
Well, I mean, if he was traveling to
Asia, so
if he was traveling there, yes, you probably had some influence. But yeah, I think it's sort of a bit of an outlier of an example. But yeah, I think we sort of the takeaways from this episode are, on the one hand, are kind of pessimistic. On the other hand, there is a little bit of hope, but that hope is more about these almost like, again, if we're going to use the rough comparison of the Dark Ages, which again, I'm not a big fan of that, but let's think about maybe Christian culture surviving in Irish monasteries or something like that. So it's very, very roughly speaking, there are people who are maintaining the skill level necessary for producing more aesthetically pleasing naturalistic art, which doesn't mean that you can't produce stylized art, like I said before. And so maybe there is some hope in maintaining that tradition, even though there's this big void that needs to be filled with something, because right now it's nihilism. And as we know, things can change very slowly and things can change very quickly. It's kind of like that quote that's attributed to Lenin. I don't even know if it's Lenin, that sometimes, remember, it's like we can live centuries in a year, and sometimes decades seem like a single day, or whatever that quote is. You know what I'm referring to. My brain is fried by now. But yeah, so things can really change very quickly, or they can change slowly, and sometimes it's difficult to tell in which direction things are going. Okay, do you have any parting words?
No, my brain's fried now.
Your brain is fried due to sleep deprivation. My brain is fried due to sleep deprivation for other reasons.
Kind of other reasons, but yeah.
Sort of other reasons, yeah. Well, I do not have a new baby, so.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think this is something that, I mean, I've wanted to discuss culture. Remember, I keep saying we even had someone that I was going to discuss culture with, and we just never got to discussing culture. So this is definitely something that we can keep coming back to. It doesn't have to be visual arts. I think talking about some of those controversial questions, like the gender question, would be interesting, because I always find myself sort of like, I hate to say in the middle, because I'm not really a centrist, but I can kind of see, again, using the traditional political compass, which is problematic, but let's use it, right, between the left and the right. I can sort of see value in some arguments, although, of course, I lean in a certain way. So perhaps without being pulled off YouTube, we can talk about those things maybe at a later date.
At a later date, and very well scripted.
Possibly.
Possibly, yeah. Yeah, no, I'm...
Hey, I scripted this episode. I have a whole bunch of notes sitting in front of me.
I don't.
You don't.
Yeah, no, I think the episode was fantastic. Talking about this is something that I bring sometime on the channel with oh boy, not a good day to remember names, with Rafael, Machado. This is something that we are trying to, we have a project called, Starting Point, translated is Pontapé Inicial in Portuguese, that we try to identify what could be. This project actually was sparkled by a conversation that I have with you, perhaps in the first time you came to the channel, and that I realized that we don't know what Brazilian or South American civilizations are about, or if there is even a concept of civilization there. And we decided to do that to identify it. And I think this kind of projects can be the type of projects that can bring investment, perhaps.
Yeah, 5 years later,
crowdfunding.
we're fundraising for some artist.
Fundraising, exactly. Why not? By the way, someone mentioned here, Geopolítica in Portuguese, mentioned here that the artist I'm talking about, her name is Cura with K. It's beautiful. Try to search for it. I'll send you links later.
In
It's
Russian, that
beautiful
means
music.
chicken, so.
Okay.
Hopefully it's
she's
better than a
Portuguese.
chicken. Like a hen, yeah. Kurica.
Cura is in Portuguese would be like healing.
Okay, so for us it's a chicken, kind of a slang way of
And
saying
for us,
chicken. For you it's a healing. Speaking of cultural relativism. Well, thank you guys for watching. This was a little bit unorthodox. We'll definitely do more politically focused episodes. Hopefully we'll have our guests that we've spoken to next week. I also will try to continue doing my shorter historic videos, but if you've never done a video, those take a long time, even though it might be 10 minutes or 15 minutes, not just the research, but pulling everything together, making sure that it's not going to be pulled for copyright, even though it's technically news media and it should be allowed under education. So there are all this other crap that goes into it, as much as I enjoy making those. But I will make some more. I'm working on one right now. Hopefully before next year, it'll come out. Thank you for watching. Marcelo, any parting words?
Well, guys, remember that all the links are on the description. I think I'm going to put the links that you sent me also on my description so people can check what we talked about. And I'll put some links to, Cobra and whatever we discussed today also in the description so people can go there and, see ugly, but also see beauty. Why not?
See ugly. Thank you, Marcelo. Thank you guys for watching. We will see you next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye.